The emergency klaxons rang through the council chambers for the first time in 47 years, and Ambassador Velkara of the Jorvine hegemony felt her throat sacs tighten with instinctive alarm. She glided into the circular assembly hall where representatives from 216 species already gathered in clusters, their worried voices creating a cacophony of concern that echoed off the crystal dome overhead. "Order," Council Director Thanavolume commanded, his massive frame rising from the central podium and his forearms spreading wide in the traditional gesture of authority, and the chamber fell silent. "We have a situation unlike any in Council history," Thanavolume announced, his voice carrying the weight of genuine worry, and Velkara noticed his scales had paled to an almost white shade, which indicated deep stress among his species. "Humanity has gone silent." He continued. A ripple of confusion spread through the assembly, and several representatives exchanged glances that suggested they did not understand the severity of this announcement. Representative Zixstar of the Silicon Collective spoke first, their crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns across the walls and floor beneath them. "Silent in what capacity, Director?" they asked with typical Silicon directness that sometimes bordered on rudeness, according to most organic species present today. "In every capacity," Thanavolume replied, and his voice grew heavier with each word, and Velkara felt something cold settle in her stomach at his tone. "All human transmissions ceased 17 standard days ago," he explained while bringing up a holographic display that showed the human territories highlighted in red across the galactic map floating above their heads. "We initially attributed this to a technical malfunction, or perhaps a localized political event requiring their attention," Thanavolume continued as the map zoomed in on specific human worlds and stations. "However, no response has been received to any of our communications and trade vessels report. The human ports are not responding to docking requests or standard hailing protocols anymore." He said. Velkara leaned forward in her seat because humanity had always been reliable and prompt in their communications, if nothing else about them stood out as particularly remarkable or noteworthy to most council members who rarely gave them much thought. "Perhaps they require assistance," suggested Ambassador Mortek of the Ring Confederacy, his whiskers twitching with what Velkara recognized as genuine concern, because the Vrin had always maintained cordial relations with humans. "That was our initial assessment," Thanavolume agreed while gesturing to bring up new data streams that scrolled across multiple screens surrounding the central hologram display unit. "We dispatched scout ships to 3 major human worlds, Earth, Nova Columbia, and Kepler's Hope," he said, and paused in a way that made every representative in the chamber lean forward with anticipation and growing dread. "What they found defies explanation," he admitted. The holographic display shifted to show video feeds from the scout ships, and Velkara watched with growing horror as the cameras panned across human cities that looked completely normal, except for one devastating detail. There were no humans anywhere to be seen in any of the footage being displayed before the assembled representatives of the Galactic Council to date. Cameras showed streets with vehicles parked neatly along the sides, and traffic signals still cycling through their programmed sequences without any purpose or audience to direct anymore. They showed apartments with lights on and music still playing from entertainment systems that nobody was listening to or enjoying in any measurable way. Now they showed restaurants with tables set for meals that would never be eaten, and food that had long since grown cold on plates arranged for diners who had vanished completely. They showed office buildings with computer terminals still running and displaying data to empty chairs arranged in neat rows throughout the various floors and departments. "No bodies," Thanavolume said quietly into the stunned silence that had fallen over the chamber, like a suffocating blanket of incomprehension and fear. "No signs of struggle, no indication of violence or forced evacuation," he continued while more footage played. across the screens, showing the same eerie emptiness repeated across different locations. No messages explaining their departure. No warnings, no requests for help. He added, with each statement driving home the absolute strangeness of what they were witnessing together. It is as if the entire human species simply decided to leave everything behind and vanish into the void. He concluded, impossible. Valkara heard herself say aloud, though she had not intended to speak, and dozens of eyes and sensory organs turned toward her position in the assembly. No species can coordinate such an action across dozens of worlds simultaneously without leaving some trace. She argued, while her analytical mind refused to accept the implications of what she was seeing. We thought so too. Then a volume replied while bringing up another data stream that showed communications, intercepts from the days leading up to the silence. However, our technical teams did find one thing, he said, and highlighted a specific transmission that had been broadcast from Earth on the last day. Humanity had been in contact. The message was brief and delivered in 17 languages so that every major council species could understand it without requiring translation, protocols, or linguistic assistance. A human woman appeared on the screen. Middle-aged by their standards, wearing simple civilian clothing and standing in what looked like a modest home rather than any official government facility, to the Galactic Council and all species therein. She said calmly, her expression neutral, and her voice carrying no anger or distress that Valkara could detect from the recording. Humanity is exercising our right to withdraw from Council space and jurisdiction. The woman stated plainly, as if announcing something as mundane as a change in trade policy. We're done, she said with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes in any way that suggested genuine happiness or satisfaction. Good luck, she added. And then the transmission ended abruptly, leaving only static in its wake on the recording. The council chamber erupted into chaos as representatives shouted questions and theories across the assembly floor, while Thamevol tried unsuccessfully to restore order. Valkara sat frozen in her seat, replaying those final words in her mind over and over again, while trying to understand what they truly meant. We're done, the human had said. Done with what? Valkara wondered as the implications began to sink in slowly like poison spreading through her thoughts. Done with the council. Done with galactic civilization. Done with all of them. But why and how and where had they gone, and what did this mean for the galaxy they had left behind? She looked around at her fellow representatives arguing and panicking, and realized that none of them had any answers to these questions. They had not paid enough attention to humanity to see this coming, had not valued them enough to understand what might drive them to such an extreme action. Humanity had always been there, reliable and steady and unremarkable in their consistency and contributions to council operations and initiatives. And now they were gone, all of them completely. Vrak felt the first tremors of real fear begin to spread through her body as she considered what might happen next in a galaxy suddenly deprived of humanity's presence. The chamber continued its chaos around her, but she barely heard it anymore because her mind was already racing ahead to calculate the consequences of this unprecedented event. Humanity was gone, and something told her that the galaxy would never be the same again after this moment. 3 weeks after humanity's disappearance, the first cracks appeared in galactic civilization, and they appeared exactly where nobody had been looking for them. The Zorthan Compact mobilized their fleet along the disputed border with the Kryn Dominion, and within hours, the Kryn responded with their own military deployments that escalated tensions faster than anyone had anticipated. Ambassador Valkara watched the tactical displays in the council war room with growing horror as the two powers moved toward open conflict for the first time in 73 years. Why now? She demanded of the military analysts who surrounded the holographic battle map with grave expressions on their various faces and sensory appendages. The humans were mediating. One of them replied, a young Vryn officer named Kestrel, who had worked extensively with human diplomatic corps in previous assignments. "What do you mean, mediating?" Valkara asked while her attention remained fixed on the fleet, movements that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. They had been conducting quiet diplomacy between the Zorthan and Kryn for decades. Kestrel explained while pulling up communication records that showed an extensive network of human diplomatic activities, low-level talks, cultural exchanges, trade agreements that benefited both sides. Subtle pressure applied at exactly the right moments. He continued while highlighting specific examples from the records. The council never asked them to do this. Valkara protested, because there were no official mandates or directives authorizing such extensive human involvement in Zorthan-Kryn relations. No. Kestrel agreed quietly. They just did it because somebody needed to, and nobody else was willing to put in the work required for such a thankless task. Valkara felt something uncomfortable twist in her stomach at those words, but she had no time to examine the feeling, because alerts began flashing across every screen in the war room. The Zorthan had fired on a Kryn patrol ship, and the Kryn were preparing to respond with overwhelming force against Zorthan positions along their shared border. "Get me ambassadors from both sides immediately," Valkara commanded while moving to the communications station to attempt what the humans had apparently been doing for decades, without anyone noticing. But the ambassadors refused to take her calls, and within an hour, the first full-scale battle had begun between two of the galaxy's major military powers. The Council scrambled to respond, but their peacekeeping forces were stretched thin across multiple emerging crisis points that had appeared seemingly overnight across known space trade. Routes that had functioned smoothly for generations suddenly collapsed as shipping companies discovered that their scheduling algorithms had been designed and maintained by human logistics experts who were no longer availably received. Reports of cargo ships stranded at stations because nobody could figure out the optimal transfer protocols that humans had established and managed for everyone else's food. Shipments destined for non-agricultural worlds sat rotting in warehouses because the distribution networks had relied on human coordination that nobody had bothered to learn or replicate. How did we not see this? Council Director Thanavolume asked during an emergency session where representatives shouted blame at each other while their civilizations began to fracture. "Because we never looked," Kestrel said loudly enough to cut through the noise and chaos of accusations flying across the chamber between angry representatives. The praise of accusations, the impersonations flying across the chamber between angry representatives. The room fell silent, and the young Vryn officer stood at his station in the analyst section, where junior staff normally remained quiet during council sessions. "Continue," Thanavolume commanded after several moments of stunned silence from the assembled representatives who had never been interrupted by a junior analyst before Kestrel stepped forward with data tablets clutched in his paws and his whiskers trembling slightly with either fear or anger that Valkara could not quite determine. "I have been reviewing human activities across the past century," he began while projecting data streams onto the central holographic display for everyone to see. Clearly, humans operated 47 cultural exchange programs that reduced interspecies tensions across the core worlds. He stated while highlighting specific programs and their measurable impacts on conflict reduction. They maintained the translation protocols that allow all of us to communicate without misunderstandings caused by linguistic drift or cultural context. He continued showing the complex algorithms that nobody else had fully understood. They ran the agricultural research stations that developed crop variants capable of growing in different atmospheric conditions, feeding billions across species who could not produce their own food efficiently. He added, they staffed the majority of positions in conflict mediation, logistics coordination, technical standards committees, and cultural preservation archives. He went on while the list of human contributions grew longer and more comprehensive. They did all of this while being consistently denied expansion rights into new territories, having their council votes weighted lower than most other species, and being overlooked for prestigious appointments and recognition, Kashturo said with clear anger breaking through his professional demeanor. And we never noticed because we never valued the work they were doing. He concluded. Velikar looked around the chamber and saw her own dawning horror reflected in the expressions and body language of representatives from dozens of different species assembled here. They had built their civilization on humanity's invisible labor, and then convinced themselves that humans were unremarkable because their contributions were steady and reliable rather than flashy or dramatic. They were the foundation, she said aloud while her analytical mind finally grasped the full scope of what they had lost. And we built everything on top of them without ever acknowledging that they were holding us up. Then a volume added quietly. More reports flooded in over the following days, and each one revealed another system or service or function the humans had been quietly maintaining for everyone else. The power grid optimization on 17 major station hubs had been managed by human engineers, and now those stations were experiencing cascading failures. The star chart updates that kept navigation safe through unstable regions had been compiled by human astronomers, and nobody else had kept current with the work. The medical exchange programs that shared treatment innovations across species had been coordinated by human physicians and researchers who understood both biology and diplomacy. The educational materials that taught species about each other's cultures and histories had been written primarily by human scholars and anthropologists working in obscurity. Everything was falling apart because the galaxy had been held together by the species they had taken for granted for centuries. Valara watched as 3 more conflicts erupted along borders that humans had been quietly patrolling and mediating without official recognition or support from the Council. She read reports of economic collapse in sectors that had relied on human-maintained trade agreements and logistics networks that nobody else could replicate quickly enough. She listened to pleas for help from colonies that had depended on human agricultural support and medical assistance that was no longer available to them. And, through it all, one thought kept repeating in her mind like a drumbeat of accusation and regret. They had done this to themselves by failing to see what had been right in front of them all along. Humanity had not abandoned them out of spite or anger. She realized they had left because they were exhausted from serving people who would never appreciate or value what they gave so freely. "We're done," the human woman had said in that final message. Valara understood now what those words truly meant, and the understanding brought her no comfort whatsoever. The galaxy was unraveling because they had lost the quiet strength that had been holding everything together, and it was entirely their own fault for being too blind and arrogant to notice, until it was far too late to matter. Council Director Thanavolume stood before the assembled representatives and announced a decision that many considered either desperate or insane, depending on who you asked. "We will find humanity and convince them to return," he declared with a certainty that Velkara suspected he did not actually feel deep down. The motion passed by a narrow margin, because enough representatives understood that their civilization was collapsing without the foundation humanity had provided for so long. Thanavolum appointed Kestrel to lead the search team, despite his junior rank, because the young Vryn officer had worked closely with humans and understood them better than most council members. Velkara volunteered to join the team over objections from her hegemony superiors, who thought it beneath her station to chase after departed workers. They were not workers. She snapped at the Hegemony Council during a private communication that grew heated and tense. They were equals that we treated as servants, and now we are paying the price for our arrogance. She continued. Her superiors relented, and Velkara found herself aboard the research vessel Concordance. along with a dozen other specialists from various species, who had actually bothered to know humans as people. The team began their search in the abandoned human embassy on Council Station 7, a massive complex that had housed over 300 human diplomats and support. Staff walking through the empty halls felt like moving through a tomb, and Velkara noticed that Kestrel's whiskers drooped with genuine sadness as they explored. "I had friends here," he said quietly while running his paw along a desk where someone had left a half-finished cup of coffee that had long since grown mold. They found the first clue in the embassy's secure data archives, which had been deliberately left unlocked, with files arranged in a way that suggested someone wanted them to be found. "They left us a trail," announced Devara, a Jorvian data specialist who had worked with human archivists for years on historical preservation projects. The files revealed planning documents dating back over 200 years, showing a slow and methodical human expansion beyond the galactic rim where Council authority did not reach. "They were building something," Velkara said, while reviewing construction manifests or colony ships and resource processing facilities in unexplored space for centuries. Kestrel added with a mixture of awe and betrayal in his voice that made Velkara's throat sacs tighten. With empathy, more files showed contact reports with something the humans called the Precursors, an ancient civilization that had gone dormant millions of years ago in the space beyond known territory. The Council had declared that region off-limits decades ago, after preliminary surveys detected dangerous anomalies and unstable spatial phenomena. That made exploration too risky. Humanity had ignored the prohibition and ventured there anyway, making first contact with beings that had existed long before any current galactic species had developed. "Space travel? Why would they hide this from us?" demanded Zixtar of the Silicon Collective, who had joined the search team despite their usual disdain for emotional species. "Look at the dates," Tyre replied while highlighting the timeline of human requests for exploration rights that the Council had repeatedly denied. They asked permission 17 times over 50 years. She continued showing formal petitions that had been rejected. With barely a review, the Council told them the region was too dangerous and that human technology was insufficient for such exploration. She added, "But they went anyway and succeeded where we said they would fail." Kestrel concluded quietly. The team followed the trail from one data cache to another, each one revealing more about humanity's secret project and growing disillusionment. With the Council personal logs from human diplomats, painted a picture of a species that had given everything to galactic civilization only to be consistently dismissed and undervalued. Meeting with the Zorthan ambassador today. One log entry read from a human named Sarah Chun, who had worked in conflict mediation. Spent 6 hours negotiating a compromise on the disputed mining rights that prevented military action. The entry continued. The ambassador thanked the Council for their wisdom in resolving the dispute. It noted with obvious irony, no mention of the human mediators who actually did all the work. The log concluded. Another log from a human engineer named Marcus Webb detailed his frustration with Council oversight committees that rejected his infrastructure improvements. They said my designs were too simple and lacked the artistic merit of Jorvian architecture. He wrote, "Never mind that my designs would have prevented the power failures that killed 43 people on Station 12 last month." He added, "But Jorvian buildings look prettier, so I guess that matters more than people not dying." The entry finished with bitter resignation. Vela read hundreds of such logs, and each one drove home the same painful truth that she had been too blind to see before. Humans had been treated as competent servants rather than valued equals, and they had finally grown tired of the disrespect and condescension. Team found records of cultural submissions that human artists and writers had made to Council exhibitions and publications, nearly all of which had been rejected. Not exotic enough. Read one rejection letter to a human poet. lacks the complexity we expect from interstellar civilizations, stated another to a human composer, perhaps suitable for educational purposes among developing species. Suggested a third to a human sculptor. They told us we were boring. Kestrel said aloud while reading through the rejection notices with visible anger. They gave us everything and we told them they were not interesting enough to deserve recognition. He added the trail led them to the edge of council space, where they found a decommissioned human observation post that had been monitoring something in the void beyond. The void beyond. Post logs revealed that humans had been in regular contact with the precursors for over a century, learning from them and earning their trust through patience and genuine respect. The precursors value what we value. Read a transmission from the post commander to Earth. Hard work, reliability, humility, and the willingness to learn rather than assume we know everything. The message continued. They appreciate us in ways the Council never has and never will. It concluded. They have invited us to join them in the deep void where we can build something new. Another message stated, something where we are partners rather than invisible servants. It added, I think we should accept. The final message from the post recommended Vela stood at the observation window looking out at the darkness beyond known space and understood what humanity had found there. They had found people who valued them for who they were rather than dismissing them for who they were not. We drove them away. She said to Kestrel, who stood beside her with his whiskers trembling. Yes, he agreed simply. Can we convince them to come back? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Would you? He replied with a question that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Vela Ra thought about it honestly, imagining herself in humanity's position after centuries of thankless service to people who took her for granted. No, she admitted quietly. Neither would they. Kestrel said, but they had come this far, and the Council expected them to complete their mission, so the team prepared to venture beyond the galactic rim. They would find humanity and make their plea, even though Velkara increasingly suspected it would be futile. The galaxy they knew was collapsing, and maybe it deserved to after what they had done to the species who had held it together still. They had to try because the alternative was watching everything fall apart while doing nothing. The Concordance set course for the coordinates they had found in the observation post logs and jumped into the unknown. Darkness beyond whatever they found there would determine the future of galactic civilization, or what remained of it after humanity's departure. Rivela only hoped they were not too late to make amends for centuries of failure and blindness. The Concordance emerged from hyperspace into a region of space that should have been empty according to every council survey ever conducted instead. Velkara stared at a sight that defied everything she thought she knew about humanity and their capabilities. Thousands of structures filled the viewscreen, from massive orbital stations to planetary settlements that gleamed with lights across dozens of worlds by the ancient stars. Kestrel whispered beside her while his paws trembled against the console he had been gripping for support. The communications officer, a young silicon named Hextrin, turned from their station with lights flickering in patterns that indicated complete shock. I am detecting over 7,000 distinct human settlements across 42 star systems. They reported in a voice that wavered between disbelief and awe. That is impossible. Zixstar declared from their position at the science station, though their crystalline form had shifted to colors that betrayed their own uncertainty. They only left council space 3 weeks ago. The Silicon representative continued. No, Tavara corrected while pulling up the data they had gathered from human archives during their search. They left council space 3 weeks ago, but they have been building this for 200 years. She explained while displaying construction timelines and resource allocations. Vela felt her analytical mind struggled to process the implications of what she was seeing before them. Humanity had built an entire civilization in secret while simultaneously serving the Council and maintaining their responsibilities. Across known space, The scale of the deception was breathtaking, but so was the work ethic and dedication required to accomplish both tasks. Simultaneously, we are being hailed. Trin announced and brought up a communication channel that showed a human woman in her middle years. This is Administrator Chun of New Terra, the woman said with a professional courtesy that felt deliberately distant and formal. Welcome to human space. She added, though her tone suggested they were not particularly welcome at all. I am Ambassador Velkara of the Jorvine Hegemony, representing the Galactic Council. Velkara responded while trying to maintain diplomatic composure. We know who you are. Chum replied simply. We request permission to enter your space in open dialogue. Velkara continued according to proper first contact protocols. Permission granted. Chun said after a pause that suggested consultation with others off-screen. Follow the beacon to New Terra Station and dock at Bay 17. She instructed. The communication ended abruptly, and a concordance followed automated guidance through the vast network of human structures. Vallejo watched through the view screen as they passed colony ships large enough to house millions and research stations that dwarfed anything the Council had built. They saw agricultural platforms growing food in concentrations that could feed entire sectors and manufacturing complexes, producing goods at scales that seemed almost impossible. They did not need us, Kestrel said quietly, while observing the same overwhelming display of human achievement and self-sufficiency. They never needed us. Velkara agreed, with growing understanding. New Terra Station was larger than Council Prime and built with an aesthetic that blended human sensibilities with something else entirely strange. Geometric patterns covered the hull in ways that hurt to look at directly, and Velkara realized she was seeing precursor influence. The docking procedure was flawless, and the team disembarked into a reception area where Administrator Chun waited with a small group of human officials. Thank you for seeing us, Velkara began, but Chun raised a hand to forestall further pleasantries. Let us skip the diplomatic niceties, she said bluntly. You want to know why we left, and you want us to come back because your civilization is collapsing without us. She continued with brutal honesty. Valera felt her throat sacs flush with embarrassment at having their mission summarized so dismissively. Yes, she admitted, because there was no point in denying the obvious truth. Come with me, Chun said, and led them through corridors that mixed human architecture with flowing organic shapes that seemed to shift subtly. They entered a massive observation gallery where windows looked out on a construction project that beggared belief. A structure was being built in space, something so large that it made planets look small by comparison. What is that? Zixstar asked with their usual directness. Our future, Chun replied simply. Precursors are teaching us to build megastructures that will allow us to harness the energy of entire stars, she explained. They are sharing knowledge with us that they never shared with the Council, because we earned their respect, she added. How? Velkara asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. By being honest about what we did not know, Chun said. By working hard without expecting constant praise, she continued. By valuing the contributions of others, rather than dismissing them as boring or insufficient, she added with clear reference to the rejection notices. They had found the precursors were watching the galaxy for millennia. Chen explained while gesturing to the massive structure taking shape outside. They saw how the Council operated and wanted nothing to do with species that valued flash over substance, she said. But they saw humanity doing the work nobody else wanted to do and never complaining about lack of recognition. She continued. They reached out to us because they recognized kindred spirits. She concluded. Velkar absorbed this information while watching human workers and precursor entities working together on the megastructure with perfect coordination. We came to ask you to return, she said finally. No, Chan replied without hesitation or anger, just firm finality. We gave the Council 200 years of service, she explained. We mediated conflicts, maintained systems, conducted research, and performed countless other tasks that kept galactic civilization functioning. She listed, and in return, we received condescension, rejection, and dismissal at every turn. She added, we were told our art was not exotic enough. Our technology was too simple. Our culture was boring, she said with accumulated frustration. Breaking through, we were denied expansion rights, while species who contributed far less were granted new territories. She continued, we were given the lowest vote weights in council decisions despite being founding members. She added, we were never invited to join the prestigious committees or cultural exchanges, unless you needed someone to handle logistics. She finished, so we left. She stated simply, not in anger, but in exhaustion. She clarified, we were tired of being taken for granted by people who never bothered to see our value. She explained. Kestrel stepped forward with his whiskers drooping. In a gesture of deep apology, some of us valued you, he said quietly. Some of us knew what you were doing and appreciated it. He continued, I considered many humans to be my friends. He added. Chun's expression softened slightly as she looked at the young Vrin officer. I know Kestrel, she said, using his name for the first time. There were good people in the council who saw us as equals. She acknowledged, but they were not enough to change the overall culture of dismissal and condescension. She stated, individual friendships cannot overcome systemic disrespect. She concluded, what if we changed? Velkara asked desperately. What? If we restructured the council to value all contributions equally? She proposed. Chen smiled sadly and shook her head. You will try, she predicted, and maybe you will even succeed for a while. She acknowledged, but eventually you will fall back into old patterns, because the foundation of your civilization is built on hierarchy and prestige. She explained, we are building something different here, she said, gesturing to the space beyond the windows. Something based on mutual respect and recognition of value, regardless of how flashy or exotic it appears. She continued, you are welcome to join us as individuals, she offered, but the council as an institution is not welcome here. She finished with finality. Valor felt the last of her hopes collapse as she understood that humanity was truly gone from galactic civilization. Can't we at least tell them what we found? She asked. Tell them whatever you want, Chum replied, but understand that other species are already accepting our invitation to leave council space. She revealed, the Vrin Confederacy has sent 3 colony ships. She listed, the Margov Collective is relocating half their population. She added, even some Jorvine are asking about emigration. She concluded while looking directly at Velkarate. Galaxy was not just losing humanity anymore, but fragmenting as others followed them to something better. The council had not just driven away one species, but it revealed their own inadequacy so thoroughly that others wanted to leave as well. Volkara understood then that they had not just lost humanity, they had lost the future. The Concordants returned to council space carrying news that nobody wanted to hear, but everyone needed to understand. Velasin Vela stood before the assembled representatives and delivered her report with a clarity born from witnessing the consequences of their collective failure. Humanity is not coming back. She began without preamble or diplomatic softening. They have built a new civilization beyond our reach, and they have no interest in rejoining the council that dismissed them for centuries. She continued. The chamber erupted in protests and denials, and accusations that Velkara had failed in her mission to convince humanity to return. Silence. Then a volume commanded, but his voice lacked the authority it once carried, because everyone could see the defeat in his bearing. Velkara activated the holographic display and showed them images of New Terra and the thousands of human settlements they had discovered. She showed them the megastructure being built with precursor assistance and the scale of human achievement that had been hidden from them. She played recordings of her conversation with Administrator Chun and made them listen. To every word of humanity's rejection, they left because we made them feel worthless. She stated bluntly when the recordings ended. We took their contributions for granted and told them their culture was boring. She continued, we denied them opportunities while granting them to species who contributed far less. She added, now they are building something greater than we ever allowed them to achieve. She concluded. Representative Star rose from their seat with crystalline form flickering in patterns of agitation. Then we rebuild without them. They declared with typical silicon pragmatism. We adapt our systems and find new solutions to the problems their departure created. They proposed. It will not work. Keshtarul interrupted from his position beside Velkara. Other species are leaving too. He revealed while bringing up emigration data from the past month. The numbers were staggering and growing larger each day, as more species applied to join humanity in their new civilization. The Vren Confederacy had officially announced they were withdrawing half their member worlds from Council jurisdiction. The Margov Collective had begun dismantling their core worlds. To move everything beyond the galactic rim, even individual Jorvine and Silicon were applying for emigration despite their species. Official positions against leaving. Why? Demanded Ambassador Mortek. Of the Vren, though he already knew his own people's reasons for departing, because humanity showed them there was an alternative. Tavara answered from the analyst section. An alternative to a Kanav to a Vamastavusoren. Council that values prestige over substance and flash over function. She explained, an alternative to being judged by how exotic or interesting your species appears, rather than what you actually contribute. She continued, humanity offered them respect and recognition for their efforts. She concluded. The chamber fell silent as representatives absorbed the full implications of what they were hearing. Their civilization was not just losing humanity, but fragmenting as other species followed them towards something better. The Zorthan-Kryn War had escalated to full-scale conflict, consuming resources and lives, at an alarming rate. Trade routes remained collapsed with no solution in sight. Because nobody could replicate the human logistics systems quickly enough, stations were failing. Colonies were starving, and conflicts were erupting across borders that had been stable for generations. Everything was falling apart exactly as humanity must have known it would when they planned their departure. We need to change, Balkara said. Into the silence. We need to fundamentally restructure how the Council operates if we want to survive. She proposed, change how? Thanavolume asked with genuine curiosity rather than defensive skepticism. Equal voting rights for all species, regardless of perceived prestige. Valkara began listing reforms, recognition and reward for contributions. That maintained civilization rather than just flashy achievements. She continued, support for cultural expressions from all species without judgment of exotic value. She added, fair distribution of expansion rights based on need rather than political favor. She proposed, and most importantly, humility. She concluded, humility to recognize when we are wrong and arrogance to admit when we have failed. She stated, the proposals faced immediate resistance from species who benefited from the current system and saw no reason to change. Ambassador Telvex of the Kroner Dominance stood to voice objections that Velkara had anticipated. Why should we diminish our influence to accommodate species who contribute less? He demanded, because those species are leaving. Velkara replied sharply, and soon we will be left with only the arrogant and prestigious, while everyone who actually does the work goes elsewhere. She added the argument continued for hours with representatives divided between those who understood the necessity of change and those who refused to accept responsibility. Finally, Thanavolume called for a vote on implementing Velkara's proposed reforms. Measure passed by the narrowest possible margin with exactly enough support to meet the threshold for constitutional changes. It is done, Thanavolume announced with visible Relief, the council will reform itself or it will cease to exist. He stated, but even as the reforms were being drafted into official council law, more species announced their intention to emigrate beyond the rim. The hemorrhaging of galactic civilization continued despite the council's belated attempts to correct. Centuries of mistakes. Velkara watched the emigration numbers climb and understood that the damage was already done. They could change the council's structure, but they could not change the past or erase the memories of those who had been dismissed and undervalued. Some species would stay and give the reformed council a chance to prove itself capable of genuine equality, but many others had already made their choice to follow humanity towards something new and untainted by the old prejudices. 3 months after humanity's departure, Velkara received a personal message from Administrator Chen. "We have been watching your reform efforts." The message began, "We appreciate the sincerity, even if we remain skeptical of the long-term success." It continued, "Individual members of the council are welcome to emigrate if they wish." It offered, "We judge people by their character and contributions, not by their species or political affiliations." It stated, "You would be welcome here, Velkara." It concluded. Velkara sat in her quarters aboard Council Station 7 and considered the offer seriously. She had friends among humanity and respect for what they had built beyond the rim. She could leave behind the council and its centuries of dysfunction to join something better, but she had also committed herself to fixing what was broken rather than abandoning it entirely. "I will stay," she composed in her reply to Chun. "Someone needs to ensure these reforms are implemented properly," she explained. "Someone needs to hold the council accountable for its promises." She added, "But I appreciate the offer and the recognition." She concluded. Jin's response came quickly and carried warmth that had been absent from their previous interactions. "I understand." It read simply, "The galaxy needs people like you willing to do the hard work without expectation of glory." It continued, "That is something we learned from being human." It added, "Good luck, Ambassador." It finished. Valara saved the message and returned to her work coordinating the council's reformation efforts. The Zorthan-Kryn War still raged, and the trade routes remained broken, and colonies still suffered from supply shortages. But slowly, painfully, the council began implementing changes that might prevent future species from feeling worthless enough to leave. They created new recognition programs for mundane but essential contributions to galactic civilization. They reformed voting rights to ensure equal representation regardless of species prestige or exotic appeal. They established cultural exchange programs that celebrated all forms of artistic expression without judgment. They even began training new mediators and logistics coordinators to fill the roles humanity had abandoned. It was hard work, and progress came in small increments that felt insignificant compared to the scale of the crisis. But it was work that needed doing, and Velkara threw herself into it with determination. Born from understanding what happened when such work was left undone years later. Standing in the reformed council chamber, she listened to a young human child's question carried across subspace communications. "Will we ever go back?" the child asked. Someone off-screen. An older woman's voice replied with gentle finality, "We already are back. We are home." The grandmother concluded. Velkara understood what the woman meant by those words. Humanity had not abandoned their home, but rather recognized that home was wherever they were valued and respected. They had returned to themselves by leaving behind those who could not see their worth. The council would survive and possibly even thrive under its new reform structure, but it would never be what it could have been. If they had valued humanity from the beginning, that opportunity was lost forever, and the galaxy would have to live with the consequences of its blindness. Velkara accepted this reality and continued her work because someone had to do it. Someone had to maintain the foundations even when nobody was watching or offering praise. She had learned that lesson from humanity, and she would honor their memory by ensuring the Reformed Council never forgot Ith.